Hey everybody, this is our third video in the How Did We Get Here series. Today we're really going to dig in and talk about the Civil War. You know, the Civil War has become quite hotly debated in the last couple of years with discussions about Confederate monuments, Confederate flags, and just the meaning of the Civil War, what it means for different Americans in our country. And it's become quite hotly contested. You know, I think it's really interesting that a war from 150 years ago still has such impact on us as Americans today. And I would argue it's really not the facts of the war or the specific details of the war that are why it becomes so contested. It's the meaning, it's the memory of the Civil War that becomes important for us. You know, as historians and history teachers have taught the Civil War over the last few generations, many, especially in the South, have taught the Civil War as a war of northern aggression or a war between the states, right? In some ways, renaming the Civil War a little bit differently is a way to distract from what the war was really about. It's a way to try and say that the war wasn't about slavery, the war was about states' rights. Or it was about economic differences, right? Or it was a defense of the Southern way of life. And this is what that argument implies in those ways. And I would say, yeah, it was about states' rights, economics, and the Southern way of life. But it was the state's right to allow slavery, and it was the economic benefits of slavery, and it was the Southern way of life that was built upon slavery and white supremacy. The war really was about slavery at the end of the day. And as we'll see today, we're going to kind of see this as we look through the history today. But this is not really a new argument. A lot of people in recent years have said, you know what, this is just a very modern, postmodern, liberal critique of the South and of the Civil War. But in 1928, U.B. Phillips, a very preeminent historian of the time, made this same argument. He made the claim that what truly united the South together, particularly white Southerners, was the belief that the South shall be and remain a white man's country. This is what the white Southerners believed, that the South was and was going to continue to be a white man's country. So the Civil War, the Reconstruction that would follow, the Jim Crow laws, all those things were ways to restrict the South and restrict black Southerners to being a part of a institution and establishment of white supremacy in the South. For this video, as we talk about the Civil War, my interest is not really in battles and military history. There's a lot of great documentaries and books and things out there on that. My interest really is in the causes of the Civil War, which I think will show you that the Civil War really was about slavery, but also how Christian denominations and Christian churches began to break up in the midst and in the lead up to the Civil War, and then eventually how emancipation becomes a goal of the Civil War. And so those are kind of the three things we're going to talk about today as we talk about this is the causes, the breakup of Christian denominations, and emancipation. And I think if we put those things in mind, it will help us remember what the Civil War was about and what it should mean for us today as we think about it more clearly. So let's start by talking about the expansion of slavery leading up to the Civil War. In the early 1800s, the British had actually abolished the slave trade in 1808. But in that same moment, the slave population in the United States was growing and expanding. We talked about last time that the gender balance for slaves in the United States, as well as the birth rate of slaves in the United States, allowed United States slave owners to not import slaves, but simply buy and sell slaves internally within the United States amongst themselves. As we get closer to 1861, you'll see in these maps here that slavery is beginning to expand. It's beginning to move westward, and it's becoming very concentrated in certain places, especially South Carolina, Virginia, Mississippi, and Louisiana. All states which are going to be pretty important to our story today. Really, the expansion of slavery is tied to this idea of westward expansion. In 1763, the British had actually passed a law saying that British colonists could not move past the Appalachian Mountains because they didn't want them to conflict with the French and the native peoples on the other side of the Appalachians. So after the American Revolution and independence, settlers quickly moved across those mountains into places like Kentucky and Tennessee. And then in 1808, with the Louisiana Purchase, we added a whole new variety of lands even further west. More settlers move into that area. But the Louisiana Purchase had previously been ruled by French and Spanish leaders who had allowed slavery in those places. So even the people that we took over in the Louisiana Purchase were already slave owners and wanted to maintain their slavery. Southerners, particularly from Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, began to move westward as well into these new lands, and they were particularly the sons and daughters of slave owners. They had enough wealth to allow them to move into these new places, establish new plantations in these areas, but of course they took some of the family slaves with them as they went. And so what starts to develop in the United States in the early to mid 1800s is this conflict between slave states and free states. There were certainly political parties and some conflict happening there, but the conflict really was about slave states and free states in the U.S. Congress, and they both wanted to keep a balance between them. Slave states are primarily southern states that are agriculture and dependent upon slave labor for their institutions to exist. Free states are primarily northern and eventually midwestern states that are more manufacturing and family farms that they're based and rooted upon. And so these two economies were very different, but the issue at its core was about whether or not a state could be slave or free as it began added to the Union. And so they were always trying to keep this balance of power. So in 1820, in the Missouri Compromise, the first effort to compromise and kind of keep a balance of power was struck. And so in the Missouri Compromise, Maine gets added to the United States as a free state, and Missouri gets added as a slave state. And a line is drawn at the 3630 parallel, the southern border of Missouri. It's drawn across the United States. And it's stated at this point that all states below this line can be slave states, and all states above it can be free states. Now, as you can see when you look at this map, this is going to become a bit of conflict because there's a lot of future states in the United States that are going to be above this line. And that's where the conflict's going to come in. But the assumption at the time was states below this line had a climate that was conducive to crops and goods that needed slave labor. And so this is why that compromise was made. Now, that compromise didn't last very long. By 1848, when the Mexican-American War ended, all kinds of new states had to be considered. Texas, California, they didn't fit the Missouri Compromise. And so again, a new compromise was struck, the Compromise of 1850. California gets added as a free state. But there's also another compromise that's added in the Compromise of 1850. There is a reinforcement and an invigoration of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, this act had originally been passed in 1793, but the new provisions would require federal marshals and other judicial officials to return slaves to their owners in slave states. So if a slave escapes into a free state, that free state has to return the slave back. This hadn't been enforced very well. It wasn't a common practice, but southern states and slave states wanted this to be the case. But the unfortunate reality of this is that all it took to be declared a slave and be returned was the testimony of a white person. The supposed slave had got no trial, no ability to defend themselves as a potential free person, and so a lot of corruption happened. And the story 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup is an example of a free black person who's taken back into the South and accused of being a slave when he in fact was not a slave at all. And so there's a lot of corruption in this system. Now, these compromises kept everybody appeased, at least all the white people appeased. No one was asking free or enslaved African Americans how they felt about these compromises at the time. But a small group of people began to critique these compromises as not good for us as a nation. And in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist and began publishing a weekly newspaper called the Liberator. And he began arguing for full and complete emancipation. He wanted to influence policymakers, politicians, and just the general public to see his point of view on this issue. Now, early on, Garrison had been supportive of a very gradual emancipation. He'd even at times been supportive of recolonizing the slaves back to Africa. But by the time the issue of the first issue of the Liberator comes out, he began to advocate for immediate emancipation. And this is what he says when he writes in the first issue in 1831. I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a case like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. The apathy of the people is enough to make every statue leap from its pedestal and to hasten the resurrection of the dead. These are strong words. Garrison is representative of a very small but very vocal minority of white and African American abolitionists in the North who began advocating for full and complete emancipation, not just the compromises that are happening at the time. Eventually, Garrison would begin shipping the Liberator into the South to try and attract the attention of enslaved African Americans. And as we'll see in a little bit, this is one of the things that infuriates white Southerners at the time. Now, the Compromise of 1850, just like the one of 1820, didn't last very long. By 1854, there were already discussions being made about the statehood of Kansas and Nebraska. Now, you'll remember from our map of the Missouri Compromise that Kansas and Nebraska are north of the 3630 parallel. They should have been free states. But at the time, there were more free states than there were slave states. So Southern politicians did not want another free state added to the Union. So Stephen Douglas, yes, that Douglas from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, actually creates a compromise in 1854 where he allows Kansas and Nebraska in the KansasNebraska Act to popularly vote for whether their state will be free or slave. This is how the issue is going to be decided. So the Missouri Compromise gets thrown out, KansasNebraska Act comes in, and the states are going to vote on whether they're going to be a free state or a slave state. Now, immediately what happens is pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates flood into Kansas at first because they're the first to vote on statehood. So they flood into Kansas and they want to either settle themselves in Kansas and establish residency or even vote illegally in the elections. And so in 1855, the first election in Kansas, 37 of the 39 delegates elected to the Kansas legislature are pro-slavery. And so they vote for Kansas to become a slave state. And tensions ensue, all kinds of people take up arms against each other, fights break out, whole cities are taken over by different pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates. There's a lot of violence happen. This period of time gets known as Bleeding Kansas in this moment, in this period of time. That violence even spills over onto the floor of the U.S. Congress. Charles Sumner, who is a senator from Massachusetts, would actually take the floor and critique Southern politicians for having endorsed the pro-slavery advocates who are flooding into Kansas to vote for a pro-slavery state. And he would disparage many white Southerners who owned slaves, accusing them of all kinds of things. And so the next day, Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, would actually find him on the congressional floor and attack him with a cane, right? Violence is right underneath the surface, and that violence is over the issue of slavery. This is the moment, just in the years and the lead up to the Civil War. And so it's clear that as the issue gets intensified, violence is very often going to be the recourse that's going to settle this thing as we move forward. Now, out of the turmoil of the KansasNebraska Act, a new political party actually gets formed called the Republican Party. And so it's the merger of some former Whigs as well as some Free Soilers into a new party. And in 1856, when the Republican Party put their first candidate up for a presidential election, their platform would actually oppose the expansion of slavery into the U.S. territories of the West. Now, they weren't proposing getting rid of slavery altogether. They weren't going to take the slaves out of the South. They were simply saying, we don't want slavery in any more states as the United States expands. Now, they would lose the election, but their candidate, John C. Fremont, would actually win 11 of the 16 northern states. So just in that one election, it's very clear that the Republican Party is going to be the party of the North and Democrats the party of the South. So as this conflict and division is boiling in politics, it also spills over into the life of the church as well. During the early 1800s, 3 different Christian denominations, the Baptists, Methodists, and the Presbyterians, all split over the issue of slavery. Now, they all have their own story of how that kind of came about. I'm going to talk just about the Baptist story today because I think it's very instructive into how these things happen. The Baptist denomination early on had decided to remain neutral on the issue of slavery. This was something for the politicians to decide, for them to work out themselves. We're going to stay out of it. We're going to try and stay neutral. But in 1844, the Georgia State Convention wanted to kind of push the issue and see what their northern counterparts really thought about slavery. So they proposed a candidate as a missionary, a guy named James E. Reeve, who was actually a slaveholder at the same time. They proposed him as a candidate to become a missionary, and initially the Home Mission Board just tried to not decide. They put off the decision, but eventually their hand was forced. They had to make a decision, and they decided not to approve any slaveholder to any office. They said this: "We can never be a party to any arrangement which would imply approbation of slavery." So, knowing that this is the opinion of especially Northern Baptists, in May of 1845, 300 Baptist leaders would gather in Augusta and organize the Southern Baptist Convention. The organization itself is organized because the Northerners won't agree that slavery is okay. And when their first president of the SBC comes to the pulpit to give his speech, William Johnson would say, "These Northern brethren have thus acted upon a sentiment they have failed to prove, that slavery is, in all circumstances, sinful." These Southern ministers, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and many others, had begun to argue that slavery was in fact not sinful at all. That this was an argument that Northerners had decided, but they were wrong. That slavery was not sinful. And in fact, now that they're no longer in communion with these Northern brothers and sisters, they stop arguing with the anti-slavery folks. They stop arguing about whether slavery is sinful, and they start arguing that it is right and ordained by God. So now they're no longer arguing with their anti-slavery advocates in the North. They're just preaching to the choir in the South. And so many folks rise up in this moment to kind of make these arguments, and especially biblical arguments about slavery. The Noah and Ham story resurfaces again as a very popular story in this time. We saw this a couple videos ago. This time, it's not just about where the color of skin originates and where the different races originate, but it's also used as a criticism of black people as a whole. In 1851, Josiah Priest would write The Bible Defense of Slavery, and he would argue, "It's not our opinion that for this one act of Ham that dreadful curse fell upon him and his race. It was not for that one act alone, but on account of his whole character and nature that the curse of slavery was entailed on his race." So it's not just the single act of laughing at Noah, it's the fact that Ham as a whole is, in his character, is flawed. And so they would use this argument to say that black people as a whole, they're deceitful, they're disrespectful, they're mischievous, they're unintelligent, and thus they're in need of supervision from the other races. Southern ministers had a fairly easy time making these arguments because the Bible in many cases endorses slavery. It allows slaves to be named in the Bible. It doesn't critique it in any open way. Jesus and Paul never explicitly critique slavery. And so this Bible argument was very easy for them. Northern pastors, Northern theologians who were anti-slavery and looking for the Bible for defense were depending on passages like love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that's a lot more vague when you begin to apply it to the slave-slave owner relationship. And it was not quite as convincing at the time for a Christian culture that was really rooted in biblical literalism. Now, African American pastors at the time found their own ways to critique the system, and many of them would depend on the comparison of Egypt and the South. They started equating these two in the story and making this critique. In 1794, Richard Allen would publish an address to those who keep slaves and approve the practice. And he would argue this: "We do not wish to make you angry, but to excite your attention to consider how hateful slavery is in the sight of that God who hath destroyed kings and princes for their oppression of the poor slaves. Pharaoh and his princes were destroyed by the protector and avenger of slaves. Allen's giving a warning to Southerners, and especially Southern ministers, who don't see that they themselves, in fact, are at this point in the story more like Egypt than they are like Moses. Now, all of this conflict between political circles, ecclesiastical circles, would finally culminate in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln. The Southern slaveholding states couldn't do it. They saw the writing on the wall in their minds. They feared that a Republican president who had been an opponent of the expansion of slavery would also start to undo slavery in the slave states themselves. And so many of them began to secede from the Union. In December of 1860, South Carolina would be the first state to secede, and it argued in its position that the non-slaveholding states were their primary reason for separation. This is what the South Carolina secession statement said. Those states have assumed the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions. They have denied the rights of property established in 15 of the states and recognized by the Constitution. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery, and they have permitted open establishment among them of societies whose avowed object is to disturb the peace and to malign the property of the citizens of other states. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. So you can see here that the critique is that Northerners think slavery is sinful, which we've seen already, and that Northerners are antagonizing the slave states by allowing societies to exist. This is the argument that South Carolina first makes. 6 more states would follow South Carolina's example, and on February 4th, 1861, the Confederate States of America was formed. Now, President James Buchanan didn't actually oppose this effort, and in his last few months of office, before Abraham Lincoln was installed, he didn't try and stop the southern states from taking over forts, building militias, and building armies, and all these kind of things. When Lincoln was inaugurated, he did not even want to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate government or even negotiate with them. He claimed that he was not going to attack the South, but he also would not concede any lands that federal armies, federal groups currently occupied. This is going to lead to the first conflict over Fort Sumter, which was a fort out in the Charleston Harbor. And on April 12, 1861, the first shots were fired in the Civil War when a Confederate army began to assault Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor. People in the northern states were then taken up in arms, and many of them began to enlist and create militias in order to defend the United States. They were inspired by their nationalism. Southerners on the other side of the table were also inspired to begin joining the Confederacy, and 4 more states would join the Confederacy after the Battle of Fort Sumter. Now again, there's a whole lot of stuff out there, books and resources, documentaries on the battles and the conflict of the Civil War. I don't really want to focus on that. I want to talk about how emancipation becomes a goal of the war. Because you see, when the war started, Lincoln had never proposed complete emancipation. He was opposed to the spread of slavery into new states and territories, but the South seceded before he made any specific statement about attacking slavery in the South. Initially, Lincoln's reason for entering the conflict was actually just to maintain and reunify the territory of the United States against a group that he felt was not legitimate in this way. And so slavery was not an initial impulse for him. The South was entering the war in defense of slavery, but Lincoln didn't initially see slavery as a reason for the North to enter the war. Now, by 1862, Lincoln started to more clearly state that slavery was the root of the conflict. In his address to Congress that year, he would say, "One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended." Now, Lincoln would go on to propose the possibility of a very gradual emancipation ending in the year 1900, in which the United States would even reimburse slave owners for their losses. He knew this would be really costly, but he thought if it would shorten the war and perpetuate peace, then it was certainly worth it. Congress would actually pass that plan, but no Southern state would take up Lincoln on that offer. Now, at the same time, Union generals who are beginning to kind of enter into the South are constantly coming into contact with enslaved African Americans. What would happen is, as the Union Army entered a new territory, white slave owners would flee their plantations, leaving the slaves behind. And when the Union Army showed up, they would declare the slaves to be free and allow them to join their ranks, helping the Union Army as they continued to move forward. Now, on numerous occasions early on, Lincoln would actually criticize these efforts to free slaves in the South, that it wasn't part of the general's goal. He actually made some of them undo their rulings, but several of his advisors stepped in and said that this was going to be a good thing. This was emboldening the Union Army, that it was helping their soldiers on the ground, and that this effort should continue to be a part. And so Lincoln would pass a few rules to allow Union armies to begin slowly freeing slaves as they came into contact. And yet still at the end of the summer of 1862, in August, Lincoln would write in the New York Tribune, kind of going back and forth on whether slavery should be a focus of the Civil War. And this is what he says: "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save this Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." Lincoln held these two things in conflict: that personally he thought all men everywhere should be free, but that as president he was more interested in reunifying the Union and gaining unity than he was in the freedom of the slaves. Over time this would change, and by January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was finalized, freeing all the enslaved people who lived in any of the states of the Confederacy. Now again, he doesn't currently have control of these states, but the idea is that this is going to turn the tide of the war and really embolden the Union Army to go into these new places. This decision, again, was very strategic. Lincoln wants to upset the status quo of the South and hopefully drive the Confederacy back to the table to negotiate. But this doesn't happen. The Civil War continues for another 2.5 years, ending with Lee's surrender at Appomattox in 1865. By the end of 1865, Congress would pass the 13th Amendment, declaring neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. Remember that little line, that's going to come back in a little while. Whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Slavery was now abolished. But the challenge is that now that the South is being reborn without slavery, that period of Reconstruction, the nature of black and white relationships, is going to take a long time to work itself out. You know, the Civil War is part of the story of how we got here. It's a very big piece, a very important part of the story. And remembering the causes of the Civil War, the conflict among Christians, and even how emancipation became a part of the project of the Civil War is really important. But for us today, as we think about this piece of the story of how we got here, I think it also has to inform where are we going next. You know, as I read through these arguments about slavery and the different ways that people are approaching slavery, I'm convicted about maybe who I identify most with in the story. Now, I know for most of us, we're not going to identify with leaders of the Confederacy or Josiah Priest kind of defending slavery at every turn. Right? That's not how we see ourselves. But how many of us are really like Garrison or Allen in the story, and they're willing to challenge the establishment and the structures of power with a very harsh truth and an uncompromising justice? Do we feel like Garrison and Allen at times, really convincing? Or sometimes are we more like Lincoln in the story, that we just want unity and we just want peace? And if we can accomplish that by maybe not fixing it for everybody, that's okay. Some may suffer, but ultimately unity was achieved. They're tough places to be in. It's a tough decision to decide, but I think it's a thing we have to think about as we consider how we got here and where we're going next. I hope you found this helpful and informative. Check out some of the resources below for more thoughts on the issue of slavery and the Civil War, more resources. We'll be moving on in our next video to talk more about Reconstruction. So thanks for tuning in.